So before we get into the video, I just want to mention that I'm going to be in San Francisco for FFRFCon from November 1st to November 4th. I'm not speaking or anything, just going to be there to hang out and talk to fans. I can't wait to meet you guys. So I've been looking forward to doing this video for a while. I've heard about this group from multiple people, surprisingly. Now, before I get into it, I just want to note that extremism can be found anywhere. Black Israelite is kind of an umbrella term in its own right, just like Christian is, to some extent. And there are some people in this group who speak out against extremism too. So I don't want to give the impression that this entire group is extremist, but there are definitely extremists within the group. So let's take a look at its history, some of its more dangerous ideas, and its cult-like behavior. Let's get into it. So what's the history of the Black Israelites? Where'd they come from? How did it start? From the very beginning, there were a number of denominations under the umbrella of Black Israelites. One guy named Frank Cherry claimed that God told him through revelation that black people were descended from Israelites. He found the Church of the Living God, the pillar ground of truth for all nations, in 1886, which is the oldest known Black Hebrew organization. Jesus, that's a long name. The Church of the Living God, the pillar ground of truth for all nations. I know I keep coming back to Jehovah's Witnesses, but I just want to point out how much that sounds like a Jehovah's Witness title, like Zion's Watchtower, or A Witness to All the Nations, or The Nations Will Have to Know That I Am Jehovah. I don't know, it's just very Jehovah's Witnessy, Jehovah's Witness-esque. Anyways, another guy named William Saunders Crowdy had the same exact revelation around that time, and founded his own church in 1896, called the Church of God and Saints of Christ. I just want to point out something very important here. When people hear about something like that, they say, two people having the same revelation around the same time? It must be inspired by God. But they're ignoring the fact that Crowdy's church was started 10 years after Cherry's church. Not exactly the same time, and very likely not independent of each other. I hear that kind of thing from time to time. People saying the description of the Messiah just fit Jesus too well for it to be coincidence. It must be Jesus. Virgin mother, riding into town on an ass, all of it. Except for the fact that the New Testament writers had a copy of the Old Testament in front of them. They knew what the requirements were. They even retroactively tried to make Jesus fit those requirements by saying Mary was a virgin. The Old Testament does not list that as a stipulation. But lots of people around that time had a mistranslated copy of the Old Testament that used the word virgin instead of the word young woman, which is the word that was actually used in that spot in the Old Testament. So it might seem like too much of a coincidence for Jesus to not be the Messiah. But really, it isn't a coincidence at all. Coincidence doesn't even play into it. Same with these two Black Israelite groups. It might seem like the coincidence is too great, but coincidence doesn't play into it at all. There was a gap of 10 years between when one was created and when the other was created. And just to drive this home with one more point, the first automobile was invented in 1886 by Carl Benz, and independently of Carl Benz, another was invented by Gottlieb Daimler, both in Germany, both in 1886, about 60 miles away from each other, completely independently of each other. Those types of things happen all the time. Doesn't mean it's divinely inspired. In 1908, after Crowdy died, a guy named William Henry Plummer took over the church and relocated the headquarters to Virginia. Eventually, in 1931, his son, Howard Zebulon Plummer, took it over, and by 1936, they had over 200 tabernacles and 37,000 members, which is actually reasonably big. I've seen some estimates say that Scientology has about 40,000 people in it, so it was on that scale at the time. You have to remember, though, this was in 1936, right after the Depression. There were around 128 million people in the US, and there are about 325 million in the US now, so less than half of the current population. Not to mention the world population was somewhere around 2 billion, and it's 7.6 billion now. Some things to consider about it. Anyways, like I was saying, Crowdy's son William Henry Plummer took it over in 1931, and his son, Levi Solomon Plummer, became the church's leader in 1975. Then, from 2001 to 2016, it was led by Rabbi by Jehu A. Crowdy Jr., a great-grandson of William Saunders Crowdy. Since 2016, it's been led by Philip E. McNeil. A number of groups were founded in the U.S. in the late 1800s, early 1900s by both African Americans and West Indian immigrants. There are a lot of other groups too. Like I said, it's a reasonably large umbrella that covers lots of different camps. And you have to consider what was happening around that time. To give some context to when this happened, it's around the same time that Jehovah's Witnesses were forming and coming into their prime. The Civil War had just ended 30 to 40 years earlier, and the Great Disappointment had already happened in the 1840s, which caused a big schism in the Millerite movement, which led to the formation of the Seventh-day Adventists, not to mention what Mormons had going on around that time. Joseph Smith died in 1844, a few decades before this, but he left behind a well-established church. So strange cults and Christian sects were booming, and the US was still getting over the Civil War. African Americans were still trying to find their place in society, or what place they could even have. Everything was still heavily segregated. They were still heavily discriminated against. They were still brutally attacked, and nobody cared. So they banded together. They formed their own communities for their own protection and peace of mind. That's the best thing they could have done at the time. Unfortunately, being a part of these communities also required you believe some really bizarre stuff. By the by, a minute ago I mentioned camps. That's what they call their denominations. The churches are divided into camps. Also, you don't need to be black to be a member, interestingly enough. There are other non-Caucasian races like Latinos and Native Americans who join up. Some camps allow white members to join if they're sponsored by an established member, and lots of other camps hate the outliers who allow that kind of thing. A lot of the camps aren't big fans of the name Black Israelites, if for no other reason than because sometimes they allow others in. There's been talk of changing the name to just the Israelites. The one thing they all have in common is the belief that African Americans are descended from the Israelites in the Bible, and that people need to know about it. They practice a mix of Jewish and Christian doctrine, but most of them definitely do not like being called Christian. Most groups say the King James Bible is the only true Bible. I have some things to say about that, but I'll save it for later. Some camps throw out certain books from the New Testament, and some throw out the New Testament altogether and focus exclusively on the Old Testament. But that's actually a pretty small group. Most of them keep at least parts of the New Testament. Some groups include the Apocrypha in their Bibles too, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jasher, and others. I find it interesting that Jehovah's Witnesses don't put more stock in the Apocrypha too, because it totally seems like something they'd want to assess themselves, instead of leaving it to councils from the 4th or 5th centuries CE. So let's talk about some of their strange beliefs. If anybody ever wondered if racism could come from somebody other than white people, here's the proof. This is as political as I'll ever get on this channel, but I have to say that the idea that racism is power plus prejudice is ridiculous in the face of what this group believes. In my eyes, racism is hating somebody based on their race. Plain and simple. It isn't okay when white people do it. It isn't okay when black people do it. It isn't okay, period. We need less tribalism, not more. We're all humans. So here's one of their beliefs. You guys remember the Bible story about Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac, right? And an angel stopped him right before he pulled the proverbial trigger. And then Isaac went on to have 2 kids, Esau and Jacob. Esau was kind of a favorite. He had red hair, and he had a lot of it, apparently. So when Isaac was lying on his deathbed, Jacob pretended to be Esau and got Isaac to give him a blessing. And as a result of that, Jacob went on to father 12 sons, who then became the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. So the Black Israelites believe that they're descended from that line, and they think Jacob is one of their ancestors. Well, here's where it gets interesting. They think white people are descended from a race of red, hairy beings called Edomites, who come from Esau. Proof? None to be had. They just believe it's true in their hearts, and that makes it true apparently. But they make a pretty big deal out of the fact that white people are very hairy. They seriously mistreat people who they feel justified in hating, thanks to their religious beliefs. And as it turns out, there are a ton of videos on YouTube showing them acting like fools. Lots of street preachers screaming at people, making them cry, and in some cases stepping on them, oddly enough. And even stranger than that, lots of videos are posted by the groups themselves. They think this kind of thing shows them at their their best. They even have a black supremacy wing of the organization. I was gonna quote what some of them say or show some video, but honestly, it's so insanely racist against white people that I'm not even gonna bother. Just go find some of their videos yourself if you want to hear it. And for anybody else, trust me when I say that racism against white people is real. And it isn't okay, no matter who the perpetrators or the victims are. You don't have to have power to be racist. You just have to be a mind-wiped sack of shit. That's simple. So is it a cult? Like I said before, it's a pretty big umbrella, and there are some more moderate camps, but all the camps share this idea that they're descended from the ancient Israelites from the Bible. And to me, it seems like they're elevating themselves to a higher status than everybody else just by believing that. People seem to have really strange ideas about Jews in general. They either view Jews as super evil, some to a conspiratorial level, or they view them as God's chosen people. They think they killed Jesus and they control the world, or they think God put everybody else here to support Israel with our armies and money. Personally, I see the distinction between Jewish people and Israeli people. Israeli people are people who are ethnically from the Israel area. Jewish people are people who subscribe to the Jewish faith. Like Ivanka Trump, for example. She isn't Israeli, but she's Jewish. There is a difference, and it's a distinction that's lost on people a lot of the time. Don't let the line get blurred. Now, black Israelites specifically are elevating themselves above everybody else by claiming that they're God's chosen people. I don't buy it. I don't think they're descended from the ancient Israelites, but even if they were, I still wouldn't think that makes them special in any way. So anyways, that's one cult-like trait. They think they're special. They think they're unique, and everybody else is less than them. That alone doesn't make it a cult, but there are other factors involved. When the founder of one of the camps, Frank Cherry, died, members believed that he only left temporarily and that he'd return in spirit to lead through his son. So they have a high level of supernatural expectations from the church's leadership. They restrict and control clothing and hairstyle to some extent. They're given the same dietary restrictions as Jews, no pork and all that junk. And that fits into the bite model under controlling what you eat. As simple and harmless as it sounds, it counts. They put a lot of emphasis on skin color, not ethnicity, skin color very specifically. You need to have a certain skin tone or you're unclean and evil. That's very clearly instilling black versus white, us versus them, good versus evil thinking. Members are given new Hebrew names when they join. They use loaded language and cliches to stop complex thought. They reject rational analysis, critical thinking, and doubt. They generate and use propaganda extensively. They divide information into insider versus outsider doctrine. They love bomb. They teach that there's no happiness or peace outside the group. Now, obviously, they didn't meet all the criteria of the bite model, but some of the criteria they met with flying colors, above and beyond what any normal group would do. And honestly, it was kind of hard to find solid information on the group, and I only included solid information in this video, so some camps may very well meet other criteria on the bite model. It's hard to tell. I just left them out to be safe. And like I said before, I've been addressing the extreme end of this group. This is a big umbrella, and what I've said doesn't apply to every black Israelite. The one thing all camps really have in common is the fact that they think they're descendants of Jacob, and whites aren't. So it's going to be heavily church dependent. All that being said, I would say that yes, this group should be considered a cult. Some camps aren't really cult-like, but the ones that are cult-like are dangerous, and you don't know until you get in. It's better to steer clear of it completely. Not to mention that they're just factually incorrect about a lot of stuff. So I'm calling it. Yes, it's a cult. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. Check out my science channel and my podcast. I'm in the middle of reading the Jehovah's Witnesses' new book, Pure Worship of Jehovah, on the podcast right now. Check me out on Discord and Patreon and all social media. Thanks for watching, guys.